This is my final output. Rain came down on Ashcombe Hall the way grief comes upon the unprepared, all at once and from every direction. It flung itself against the tall library windows in ragged sheets, rattling the old glass until the panes seemed to shiver like living things. Beyond them there was nothing but the black shoulder of the moor and the occasional white sneer of lightning, which showed for half a heartbeat the drowned lawns and the long gravel drive that wound away toward a world too far off to help. The nearest village lay 7 miles distant across bad roads, and might as well have lain on the far side of the sea. Ashcombe Hall stood alone with its dead master and its living guests, and the storm made prisoners of them all. Inside, the library had been made ready for the reading of the will. Candles burned upon the great table, and the firelight threw long shadows up the spines of 1,000 unread books. It was a handsome room and a cold one, for all its fire, a room that had known learning once, and now knew only waiting. Upon the mantel a clock ticked with the patient cruelty of clocks, counting out the last minutes in which the late Lord Ashcombe's fortune still belonged, in the eyes of the law, to no one at all. At the far end of the room, where the candlelight thinned to nothing, sat a woman so still and so plain that a stranger might have passed her over entirely, as one passes over a chair. This was Miss Eleanor Wren, a slight woman of perhaps 40 years, dressed in a gown of unrelieved morning gray, worn thin at the cuffs. Her hair was drawn back so severely it seemed almost a discipline, and beneath it her features were quiet and unremarkable, save for the eyes, which were gray as her gown and steady as the flame of a shielded candle. Her hands lay folded in her lap. She did not fidget. She did not weep. She had done her weeping, if at all, somewhere no one had been permitted to see. For 6 years she had been the late Lord's lady's companion, had read to him when his eyes failed, walked the terrace beside his slowing steps, sat with him through the long declining evenings when the great relatives never came. And now she sat in the corner of his library on the night his estate was to be portioned out, and waited, as she had learned to wait, without complaint. The doors opened, and the storm's cold breath came in ahead of the guests. Vivienne, Lady Marchbanks, entered first. As she entered everywhere first, sweeping the wet from the threshold with the hem of her black silk. She was the late Lord's niece, and she was beautiful the way a drawn blade is beautiful, bright, sharp, and made for one purpose. Jet beads glittered at her throat and wrists in 100 small cold points. Her mouth was lovely and disinclined to smile, and her dark eyes went round the room once swiftly, pricing everything they touched, the pictures, the plate, the silver candlesticks, and they touched, last and least, the gray figure in the corner, resting upon her for the briefest instant before moving on, as though Miss Wren were a smudge upon the window, and not worth a second look. Behind her came her brother, Julian Ashcombe, shaking the rain from his fashionable dark coat and looking about him with the hungry satisfaction of a man come into a room he already considers his own. He was handsome, in the manner of young men who have been told so often that they have believed it thoroughly. A thin, dark moustache lay along his upper lip, and his mouth was habitually curled, half a sneer and half a smile, as though the world were a joke told slightly too slowly for his taste. He crossed to the fire, turned his back to it, and surveyed the shelves. "Well," said Julian, "it's a barn of a place, but it will fetch a price. Only look at all these books, Vivienne. Do you suppose anyone has ever read a single one of them?" "Uncle fancied himself a scholar in his dotage," said Vivienne, drawing off her wet gloves finger by finger. "It came of having no one sensible to talk to. One shuts oneself up with books when one has quarreled with all one's living relations, and God knows he quarreled with enough of them. She let the gloves fall upon the table, as if the table too were already hers. It was then that the third guest came shuffling in. Not a guest at all, in truth, but Mr. Pethick, the family solicitor, who had been these many hours in a cold upstairs room arranging his papers and screwing up his cautious courage. He was a stooped and elderly man in a rusty black suit that had been good 20 years before, and spectacles rode low upon his nose, over which he peered with the wary, blinking apology of a man who has spent his life delivering other people's bad news. Beneath his arm he carried a flat leather case. "My lady," he murmured, with a bow to Vivienne. "Mr. Ashcombe, we may begin whenever it suits you to be seated." "Then let us be seated," said Vivienne, "and be done. This house is like a tomb, and I have no wish to be reined into it. Julian, sit. Mr. Pethick, you may proceed." But before the solicitor could arrange himself, Vivienne's cool eye fell once more upon the corner, and this time it stayed. She regarded Miss Wren with the mild distaste of a woman inspecting a stain she cannot immediately place. "You," she said. "Yes, you, the companion, is it? Wren, there is a draught from that window, and I am chilled through. Fetch us something hot, some negus, if this melancholy house runs to it, or wine mulled at the very least, and see whether that fire can be persuaded to do its office. Well, do you understand English, or must I ring for someone who does?" Miss Wren rose, not quickly, in a flurry of servility, nor slowly in insolence, but simply and evenly as a woman rises who has decided long ago what she is and is not willing to be wounded by. "I understand you," she said, her voice low and clear, without heat. "I will see what can be done." "See that you do," said Vivienne, already turning away. At the door Miss Wren nearly met Mrs. Hobbs, the old housekeeper, coming in with a taper to tend the guttering candles. She was a round-faced, kindly woman in a starched cap and a spotless apron, and she had served the house near 40 years. Her small, bright eyes went from the great lady in her jet to the gray companion at the door, and something troubled and knowing gathered in her honest face. She caught Miss Wren gently by the sleeve. "You'll not let them speak to you so, miss," she whispered, so low it was scarcely more than a breath. "The master, he'd not have borne it a moment." "The master is not here to bear it, Mrs. Hobbs," said Miss Wren, very quietly. And then, seeing the distress plain upon the old woman's face, she softened, and laid her thin hand a moment over the housekeeper's roughened one. "Do not fret for me. It is only words, and words break nothing that is not already whole." And she went out to the cold passage to see about the wine. Behind her, the two who meant to inherit the earth made themselves comfortable in the dead man's chairs. "An odd creature," observed Julian, when the door had shut. "One of Uncle's charities, I suppose. He was forever collecting strays in his last years. What's to be done with her once the place is ours?" "Turned out, of course," said Vivienne, with a small yawn behind her hand. "One does not keep the previous owner's furniture merely because it has grown accustomed to the room. I dare say she has feathered her nest a little. They always do, these quiet ones, sitting so close to a rich old man with a failing memory. You may be sure the good silver has gone up those attic stairs." "Vivienne, how you slander the woman." Julian laughed, delighted. "I don't doubt you're right. I am generally right about such people. Butter would not melt. And meanwhile the plate goes." She lifted a candlestick, examined the hallmark upon its base, and set it down. "We shall have an inventory taken the moment the will is read. If so much as a salt cellar is wanting, she shall answer for it before she goes. I'll not be robbed by a hireling in a gray dress. Mr. Pethick, at his end of the table, cleared his throat unhappily and said nothing, and arranged his papers again. The door reopened. Miss Wren came back with the mulled wine, carried it herself, and set it down at Vivien's elbow without a word. Vivien did not thank her, but reached for the cup and drank, and made a small face, as though even the wine of that house had disappointed her. "It wants sugar," she said to the room at large, "but I suppose one cannot expect a companion to know how a lady takes her wine. Sit down, Wren, for pity's sake, you hover so. No, not there. There, by the wall, out of the light. You put me off my thoughts, standing about like a mute at a funeral." "It is a funeral, near enough," murmured Julian, and found himself very witty, and smiled. Miss Wren sat where she was bidden, by the wall, out of the light. Upon the mantel the clock ticked, and in the wavering candlelight the portrait of the late Lord Ashcombe looked down from above it, a gaunt old gentleman with silver hair and kind, tired eyes, gazing out over the heads of the living with an expression that seemed, in that shifting light, almost to be waiting for something. Miss Wren looked up at it once. The two beneath it did not look up at all. They had come for what the old man had left behind, and had no further use for the man himself. "Now, Mr. Pethick," said Vivien, setting down her cup with a small click of finality, "we have suffered this weather and this house long enough. Read us the will, and let us learn precisely how rich my late and difficult uncle has seen fit to make us." Mr. Pethick drew the flat leather case toward him. His hands, Miss Wren noticed, for she noticed everything from her corner, were not quite steady as he unfastened the clasp. He drew out a folded parchment heavy with seals, smoothed it upon the table, and cleared his throat, and when he spoke his voice had in it a curious reluctance, the voice of a man who knows more than he has yet been asked, and dreads the moment of the asking. "It is a somewhat unusual document," he began. "I should say, before I read, that his late lordship's affairs in these last months were not entirely as they had been. There were certain instructions, latterly, that spare us the preamble," said Vivien. "Read as you wish, my lady." And by the light of the guttering candles, with the storm beating at the windows and the painted eyes of the dead man looking down, he began to read the will that everyone in that room believed they had already understood. Everyone, that is, but the plain gray woman by the wall, whose calm eyes had lifted once again to the portrait, and who waited, as she had always waited, for the proper moment to be still no longer. "The last will and testament," he read, "of Edmund Fairfax Ashcombe, of Ashcombe Hall in this county, made and executed the 4th day of March, in the year of our Lord 1881. To my niece Vivien, Lady Marchbanks, I give and bequeath the whole of my estate lying to the east of the Ashcombe Brook, together with the farms of Nethercombe and Highfield, and the sum of £12,000 in the funds." Vivien did not smile. She was far too well schooled for anything so vulgar. But something moved behind her sharp, beautiful face. The settling of a creature promised a thing it always knew to be its own, and merely gratified to hear it spoken aloud. She inclined her jet-black head a fraction, as one accepting the homage of an inferior. "To my nephew, Julian Ashcombe," the solicitor continued, "I give the hall itself, with its lands, its timber, its plate, and its contents, together with the residue of my personal fortune whatsoever and wheresoever, he being the last male of the name." Julian laughed. It was not loud, but it filled the room the way a bad smell fills a room, and he leaned back in the great carved chair that only an hour ago had been his uncle's, with the ease of a man come home at last to a thing he has long felt was owed him. He looked round at the shadowed ancestors in their ruffs and their armor, not as a man looks at his forebears, but as a purchaser looks at goods that come with a house. "The hall," he said softly, "every stone of it." And then his eye fell, almost carelessly, upon the gray figure by the wall, and the pleasure in his face sharpened. "And what?" he asked, turning to Pethick, though he kept his gaze upon Miss Wren. "Does my generous uncle leave to the good woman who spooned his broth and plumped his cushions? Some remembrance, surely, a lock of his hair. A prayer book." Mr. Pethick shifted. He had never liked this part. In 40 years of reading the small unkindnesses the great write into their last testaments as an afterthought, he ran his finger down the page. "There is a clause," he admitted. "To Miss Eleanor Wren, my companion these 7 years, in acknowledgment of her attendance upon me, the sum of £30, and such of my books as my heir shall see fit to spare her, she to remove herself from the hall within 1 month of my decease." £30, Julian repeated, and now he did laugh aloud, a bright, ugly sound. £30 and a month's grace. Uncle was generous to the last. "Why, Miss Wren, that is nearly a year's wage for a woman of your station, and a whole month besides to find another sick-bed to sit beside." Vivien's cold voice came across the room like a draught under a door. She should be grateful she has remembered it all. There are those who spend a lifetime in service and are turned out with a character and a valise. She drew off one black glove, finger by finger, and laid it upon the table beside the candles, a small proprietary gesture. "Mrs. Hobbs," she said, without turning her head, "you will fetch the keys of the house to me before we retire. The still room, the plate chest, the cellars, all of them. I do not choose to sleep under a roof whose locks are in the keeping of servants I have not engaged." By the door, Mrs. Hobbs opened her mouth and shut it again. Her eyes went, helplessly, to Miss Wren, and there was in them the mute distress of an old woman who has served long enough to know what is decent and to see that decency is not what is happening tonight. But Miss Wren did not look at her. She was looking at something very far away, her hands still in her lap, and to any who watched she might have been a woman half asleep, or a woman at prayer. "The keys, Hobbs?" Vivian said again, a fraction louder, as one speaks to the dull. "Did you hear me?" "I heard you, my lady," said Mrs. Hobbs, very low, and did not move. Then a moment. The two words were not loud, quieter, if anything, than anything else spoken in that room all evening, but they fell into the middle of Vivien's command like a stone dropped into still water, and every head turned. Miss Wren had risen. She did it without haste, without drama, as she might rise to draw a curtain, and yet there was something in the unhurried certainty of her movement that stilled even Julian's tongue. She crossed to the long table, and from within the folds of her gown, from an inner pocket sewn close against her heart, she drew out a packet. It was not large, a thing of folded paper, yellowed at the edges, bound with a ribbon gone from black to the brown of old leaves, and upon the fold there sat a seal of red wax, unbroken, bearing the deep, clear impression of a signet more than one person in that room would know at a glance. She laid it before Mr. Pethick, stepped back one pace, and said in her low, even voice, "I think, Miss Pethick, that you had better read this one first." For a moment nobody spoke. The fire snapped. Mr. Pethick looked down at the packet as a man looks at a snake that has appeared upon his desk, and did not touch it. Then Julian was on his feet, the carved chair scraping back with a shriek, and the ease was gone from him. And the sneer with it, there was only a white sudden alertness, the look of an animal that has heard a sound in the dark. "What is that?" he said. "What game is this?" Pethick, don't you touch it. It is my lord's will, said Miss Wren. His will has been read, Vivian said. Her voice was still cold, still level, but there was a new edge upon it now, thin and bright as frost on a blade. That paper was read from the office copy, drawn and witnessed and lodged these 3 years past. There is no other will. There is this one, said Miss Wren. A forgery. Vivienne said the word crisply, as one lays down a winning card. A wretched forgery, cooked up by a scheming woman who saw her 30 pounds and thought to help herself to more. Julian, ring for the men. I will not have this creature standing here another his true will, Miss Wren went on. And she did not raise her voice, and yet somehow it cut clean through Vivienne's, made in his own hand and mind together, in the last weeks before he died, when the fever had gone out of him, and his mind was as clear as ever it was in his life. Signed by him. Witnessed by 2 who set their names beside his. Sealed with his own signet, the signet, my lady, that lay under his pillow, and that no forger in England had the fetching of. She turned her calm gray eyes upon Vivienne, and for the first time there was something in them that was not calm. Read it, Mr. Pethick. You knew his hand. You knew his seal. Read it, and tell them whether I am a forger. You will not read it. Julian had come round the table now, a flush upon his handsome face, his hand half lifted as though he would sweep the thing to the floor. Pethick, I forbid it. That woman has no standing here. She is a paid servant under notice, and this scrap is a fraud, and I'll see her before a magistrate for it before the week is. Mrs. Ashcombe. Pethick's voice, when it came, was dry and small and old, but it stopped Julian's hand in the air. If this document is what she says it is, then I am bound in law to examine it, and if I do not, another man will. And if it is a forgery, sir, then the examining of it is the surest way to prove her guilt, and you have nothing to fear from my reading it. Sit down. I beg you, sir, sit down. There was a silence you could break your teeth upon. And then, slowly, with a face gone the color of tallow, Julian sat. Mr. Pethick drew the packet toward him. His hands, which had trembled all evening with the palsy of age, were quite steady now. It was as though the paper had laid its own gravity upon them. He looked first, and long at the seal, and Mrs. Hobbs by the door clasped her worn hands beneath her chin as one who prays. The Ashcombe signet, Pethick murmured. The broken tower and the 3 martlets. This was not pressed from a copy. There is the little flaw in the tower's base, the chip that was in his own ring, that I have seen upon his letters these 30 years. He slid his thumbnail beneath the wax. It parted with a small dry sound. He unfolded the paper, 1 sheet and a second within it, close written in a hand that leaned and wavered but held its line, and spread it flat beneath the candles, and began to read it to himself, his finger traveling down the lines. And as he read, the room watched his face, for it was the only thing in it that was moving. The professional dryness went out of it. The caution went out of it. His eyebrows climbed toward the bare dome of his brow. He stopped and went back and read a passage again, and his hand upon the table pressed flat as though to steady himself against the tilt of the earth. Well? Vivian's voice had lost a little of its frost. It is false, of course. Say that it is false. Pethick did not answer at once. He had come to the foot of the second page, to where the signatures stood, and bent close over them. Edmund Ashcombe, he read softly. That is his hand. I would know it among 10,000. That is no drawn copy, that is written living by a hand that had held a pen 60 years. His finger moved down and witnessed, as the law requires, Dr. Aldous, who attended his lordship in his final illness, and Martha Hobbs, housekeeper of this house, by me, sir," said Mrs. Hobbs suddenly, from the door, and her voice cracked upon it, and tears stood in her round old eyes. "By my own hand, that night, in the master's room, with the doctor beside me and the master sitting up against his pillows as sensible as you or I. I set my name where he bade me. I've held my tongue since, God forgive me, for I was afeard, but it's true. I saw him sign it, and I signed under him." "Be silent, you old fool," Vivienne breathed, but there was no force in it now. It came out thin, almost pleading, and no one heeded her. Mr. Pethick straightened. He took off his spectacles and polished them upon his rusty sleeve. The action of a man buying himself a moment before he must say a thing that cannot be unsaid. And then he settled them again and looked up, his cautious old eyes coming to rest, last of all, upon the small gray woman standing quietly beyond the candles. "This document," he said, and his dry voice did not falter, "is dated the 19th of September last, some 6 months after the will I have already read to you. It is signed by the testator in a hand I know to be his own, sealed with his own signet, and witnessed as the law requires by 2 persons of full age, one of whom stands in this room. It is supported, moreover, by a physician's certificate of sound mind, which Dr. Aldous, foreseeing precisely this quarrel, appended in his own hand." He paused, and in that pause the fire seemed to hold its breath. "A later will so made and so witnessed revokes and supersedes all wills made before it. That is the law of England, and there is no soul in this room with the power to alter it." Julian's voice, when it came, was scarcely more than a whisper. "What does it say?" And Mr. Pethick looked down at the close-written page and back at the disinherited faces, and he told them. "It says that Ashcombe Hall, its lands, its timber, its plate, its fortune, the whole of the estate without reservation, is given and bequeathed to Eleanor Wren, absolutely, and to her heirs forever." He let the words settle. It revokes every legacy of the former will. It leaves to Lady Marchbanks and to Mr. Julian Ashcombe the sum of 1 shilling apiece, and it gives a reason for the smallness of the gift, which I will not read aloud in this company unless I am required to. He lowered the page. "Miss Wren is the mistress of this house. She has been so since the moment my lord ceased to breathe. Everything within these walls, and the ground they stand upon, is hers." And into the ringing silence that followed, Vivienne, whose glove still lay discarded upon the table she believed she owned, turned at last to look full upon the woman she had bidden fetch her the keys, and found that woman already, quietly, unbearably, looking back at her. Miss Wren stood exactly where she had been, her hands folded, her chin neither lifted in triumph nor bowed in apology, and she simply waited, with a patience that had once looked like meekness and now revealed itself as something far harder and far deeper. It was Vivienne who broke first. She rose with a rustle of black silk. "This is a fabrication," she said, but her voice, so accustomed to command, had thinned at its edges. "A cheap and vulgar fabrication. You expect us to believe that this drab little creature who has poured our uncle's tea and mended his cuffs is his blood? I expect you to believe nothing, Lady Marchbanks," Eleanor answered, and her quiet gray eyes did not waver. "Belief is not required. The record is sufficient. It is not a fabrication," said Mr. Pethick, and every head turned toward him. "I drew up no part of this instrument, and it wounds my professional pride to confess it. But I know Lord Ashcombe's hand as I know my own, and the men who witnessed it beside Mrs. Hobbs Dr. Aldous and the Reverend Mr. Coles of this parish would neither set a hand to a lie. Then they were deceived, Julian said, his handsome face gone tight and pale, the sneer curdled into something uglier. An old man, sick, dying, worked upon by a scheming servant while the rest of us were kept away. Of course he signed. He would have signed anything she put before him. That is not a testament. That is theft dressed up in a lawyer's ribbon. Have a care, Mist. Ashcombe, Pethick's voice, which had been mild, took on the flat weight of a man who has spent his life among the machinery of the law. You speak of undue influence. It is a grave charge, and the law will ask you to prove it, and the law is not sentimental. It will ask why, if his lordship was so feeble of mind, he was lucid enough to receive the certificate of soundness Dr. Aldous appended. It will ask why, if Miss Wren whispered day and night, the housekeeper and 3 underservants can attest she sat with him no more than any devoted nurse. And it will ask where you and your sister were during those last weeks, when your uncle lay dying and sent for you, and you did not come. The room was very still. Julian's mouth opened and closed again, and the flush that climbed his throat was not the flush of righteousness. He sent for us, Vivienne said at last, but faintly, as though the words were being drawn from her against her will. There was the season. The roads were bad. We meant to come. You meant to come when the reading was called, Eleanor said. There was no cruelty in it, and that was the terrible thing. The thing that made Vivienne flinch as she had never flinched at any insult, only truth, laid down plainly, the way one lays a stone upon a grave. You came for the will, not for the man. And into that silence gently came another voice, cracked with age and wet with tears, but steady. It's true, my lady. Every word of it. God rest him. It's true. Mrs. Hobbs had risen from the shadows near the door, and she came a few steps into the candlelight, and she looked not at Vivienne, nor at Julian, but at Eleanor, and her old eyes brimmed and spilled. I've held my tongue near 40 years, because he bid me to. But I'll not hold it in the face of the good Lord and this poor lady both. Not with him lying cold upstairs. I knew who she was the moment she stepped down from the carriage in that plain gray cloak. How could I not? I had her in my own arms when she was 3 days old. I had the dressing of her hair when she was a little maid of 7, running the length of that gallery with her sash come loose. Her voice broke, and she pressed the back of one reddened hand to her mouth before she could go on. Miss Eleanor. Little Miss Eleanor, that was sent away. Vivienne had gone very white. Sent away, she repeated. You mean the scandal, the daughter who there was no scandal but the one his own kin made, said Mrs. Hobbs, with a sudden fierceness no one in that room had ever heard from the mild old woman, when they set themselves against a girl who loved where she was told not to love. She married a poor man. That was her whole crime. A good man, a schoolmaster, with no land and no name to speak of. And the family raised such a storm about it, your grandfather, my lady, and the old aunts, all of them fearful for the money and the name, that his lordship was driven to it. They gave him no peace until he put his own child out of doors and struck her name from the family Bible with his own pen. I saw him do it, his hand shaking so he could scarce hold the pen, and I saw him weep after, alone in this library, in the dark, an old man crying like a boy. Eleanor stood motionless. Only those who watched her very closely, and Pethick was watching her closely, might have seen the small movement in her throat, the single hard swallow, before her composure closed over it again, like water over a dropped stone. He never forgave himself, Mrs. Hobbs went on, quieter now. Not in 30 years. Her husband died, your husband, my dear, God keep him, died young, and you were left with nothing, and too proud to come begging, and he learned of it too late to help as a father ought. And then last spring, when he felt the cold coming into his own bones and knew his time was short, he found a way. He couldn't undo the past with a grand announcement, the shame, the pride, all these fine relations circling, but he could bring his girl home. So he wrote for a lady's companion, a plain, quiet body, no heirs. And he hired his own daughter under a borrowed name, and kept her by him, and came to know her again, day by day, this last year of his life. The tears ran freely down the old woman's cheeks now, and she did not wipe them. It was the happiest year I ever saw him have. And when the doctor told him plain it would be his last, he had the strength, thank God, to set it right at the end, to give her back her name, to give her back everything they took. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Julian had sunk down onto the arm of a chair, his fashionable coat suddenly looking like a costume he had been caught wearing, his face empty of everything but a dawning, sickly comprehension. Vivian stood alone in the center of the room, and all her jet and silk, all her cold beauty, seemed to have turned to a kind of tawdry armor with nothing behind it. "You knew," she said to Eleanor, and it was almost a whisper, "all these months, when I sent you to fetch my shawl, when Julian mocked your gown at the Christmas dinner, and you poured the wine and said nothing. You knew all along, and you let us." "Yes," Eleanor said. "Why?" The word cracked out of Vivienne like something breaking. "Why endure it? Any woman with a shred of spirit would have thrown it in your faces." A very faint smile touched the corners of Eleanor's mouth, and it was not unkind, and that was somehow the most devastating thing of all. "You mistake me, Lady Marchbanks. I did not endure it for his sake, though I would have endured a great deal more for his sake. I endured it because I wished to know, before I was anyone's heir, exactly what manner of people I was among. And now I know. You have shown me these many months with a thoroughness I could never have purchased." She turned then, unhurried as she was in all things, to the solicitor. "Mr. Pethick, is there any impediment? Any point of law that is not settled?" Pethick straightened his stooped shoulders as best he could. "None, miss." He paused, and then, with a small, grave inclination of his head that was the first true courtesy anyone of consequence had shown her in that house, he corrected himself. "None, Miss Ashcombe. The later testament revokes the earlier in its entirety. It names you sole heir to the estate, the house, the lands, and all moneys and chattels thereunto belonging. In the eyes of the law, you have been mistress of Ashcombe House from the hour of his lordship's death. Everything within these walls is yours. Everything," he added, and there was the faintest dry edge to it as his gaze flicked toward the heirs, "and everyone permitted to remain beneath its roof is here upon your sufferance." The meaning of it settled over the room like a dropped curtain. Vivienne's hand went to the jet at her throat. Julian rose slowly from the arm of the chair. "Now see here," he began, and the old bluster tried to come back into him, but it came thin and desperate. "You cannot mean to turn us out into the night. Your own flesh and blood, whatever quarrel lies between us, there is such a thing as family." "Family," Eleanor repeated, and for the first time a low note of something harder ran beneath the calm. She let the word rest in the air between them, and Julian had the grace, at last, to look away from it. "You spoke to me a great deal of family this evening. when you thought me a servant to be paid off and sent packing before the good silver was counted. You told your sister, not an hour ago, within my hearing, that the companion should have her month's wages and be gone by morning. I have an excellent memory for such kindnesses." Julian said nothing. There was nothing to say. "You will not go into the night," Eleanor continued, and the hardness passed out of her voice as quickly as it had come, leaving only that even, unhurried calm. "I am not what you are. Mrs. Hobbs will see the blue rooms made ready, and you given supper, and your servants and horses housed. You will sleep beneath this roof one last night as you have so often slept beneath it, as guests who imagine themselves masters. And in the morning, at first light, you will take your carriages and go, and not come again. The allowance She paused, and something moved behind the gray eyes, and she chose the word deliberately. "And let it be heard, the allowance my father settled upon you both in his earlier will, I shall honor, not because you have earned it, but because he would have wished it, and because I find I would rather be the kind of mistress he believed me capable of being than the kind of relation you have been to me. You will not want. You will simply no longer be welcome. That, I think, is a fair exchange for a month's wages and a reference." It was Vivienne who wept in the end, not prettily, not for effect. There was no audience left worth performing for. She stood in the middle of that vast cold room with the tears cutting down her powdered face, and whether she wept for shame, or for the fortune slipping through her fingers, or for some dim buried knowledge of the girl who had been driven out into the dark all those years ago, while people like her looked on and approved, perhaps she herself could not have said. Eleanor watched her a moment, and there was pity in the watching, the pity of one who had wept alone in cold rooms herself. "Go and rest, Vivian," she said, quite gently. And Vivian went. Julian followed, stooped, his fine coat hanging on him like borrowed clothes, and the door closed behind them, and the grand relations who had swept into Ashcombe House like a flight of glittering crows went up its great staircase for the last time in silence. When they had gone, the room let out its held breath. "Mr." Pethick began, with reverent hands, to gather the papers together. Mrs. Hobbs crossed the floor to where Eleanor stood, and stopped before her, twisting her apron, suddenly shy of the woman she had bounced upon her knee. "My lady," she said, and then faltered, for the word felt both strange and exactly right. "Miss Eleanor, I hardly know how I'm to." But Eleanor reached out and took the old woman's two work-worn hands in her own and held them, and the composure that had held so perfectly through fury and threat and revelation trembled, at last, just slightly, at the touch of the only person in all the world who had known and loved her as a child. "You will call me Eleanor," she said, "when we are alone, as you did when I was small. And you will sit down by the fire, for you have been on your feet since dawn, and you will tell me," her voice caught and steadied, "you will tell me about him. All the small things I was too far away to see. I have his house and his lands and his name back again, and I find that none of it is worth so much to me as 1 hour of the years I lost. So you shall give them back to me, a little at a time, by this fire, for as long as we both are here." Mrs. Hobbs could not answer for weeping, but she nodded and pressed Eleanor's hands, and that was answer enough. The great house settled around them into quiet. Above, in the darkness, the deposed airs lay sleepless in the blue rooms. Without, the country night pressed black and cold against the windows. But here, in the library, where an old man had once wept alone over the name he had struck from a Bible, 2 women drew their chairs close to the last red embers, and the housekeeper began, haltingly and then more freely, to talk, of a silver-haired gentleman with kind, tired eyes, who had smiled more in his last 12 months than in all the 30 years before it, because his daughter had come home at last and sat sewing by his fire, and he had known her and been glad. And Eleanor Ashcombe, mistress of the house that had meant to cast her out, sat listening in her plain gray gown with the firelight soft upon her quiet face, no longer plain at all, to any eye that could see, and let the long-delayed inheritance of her father's love come home to her, warm and whole, at the very last.